Well, good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to this session, which is the IEA Presidential Address. And I'd like to begin by thanking the Society for the Analysis of Government and Economics for sponsoring this session. I'm especially happy to be introducing our speaker this afternoon because he and I have been friends for a long time. We are old friends in every sense of the word. Elchanan and I met as students at Harvard 54 years ago, if you can believe that. I can't believe it. So 54 years is longer than many of you have been alive. And those of you who were alive then are probably on the decline. But it was perfectly clear, even 54 years ago, that Elchanan was destined for great things, and he did not disappoint. Along with Paul Krugman, he was a creator of the new trade theory, which combined imperfect competition and scale economies within international trade. And this cleared up some long-standing empirical puzzles, such as why it is that countries that trade with one another often trade similar goods. And with Gene Grossman, he was a pioneer of the new growth theory, showing how technical progress and growth arise endogenously rather than being simply parameters in a model as in the famous Solow growth model. And these are just two examples out of many seminal contributions that Elchanan has made. For this work, he's been showered with recognition and honors. He received the BBVA Prize, the Nemers Prize, the Onassis Prize, the Lafon Prize, the Israel Prize, and on and on and on. But I have to mention that in addition to being a truly world-class economist, he's a world-class human being. Actually, one of his many great qualities is his modesty, and I can see him squirming right now while I'm talking about him. Don't worry, Elchanan, I'm almost done. But I have to mention one of his most beautiful qualities, his ability to remain calm under all circumstances and to make other people feel calm too. And I can illustrate this with a little example. Suppose you've made plans with Elchanan to meet for lunch on Thursday, but then you get word that on Thursday the world is going to be destroyed by an asteroid. You go to Elchanan and you say, "Oh my God, Elchanan, we're going to be hit by an asteroid on Thursday. What are we going to do?" He says, it's okay. We'll have lunch on Wednesday. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you the Galen Stone Professor of International Trade at Harvard and the President of the International Economic Association, Elchanan Helpman.
Thank you, Eric. You see, 50 years have passed, and now I have to switch eyeglasses. So there is a saying attributed to the Jewish sage Akavia ben Mahalalel, who lived more than 2,000 years ago. Know where you came from, where you are going, and before whom you are destined to give judgment and accounting. Although this was intended as advice for conducting one's life, I believe that it contains wisdom for scholarship as well. Economists are generally quite good at thinking about where we are going. We devote enormous efforts to identifying new questions, developing new methods, and finding new data. We are, however, somewhat less diligent in reflecting on where we came from. And as for the final part, before whom we are destined to give judgment and accounting, the conventional academic answer is straightforward: our peers. Today I would like to focus primarily on the first two questions: where we came from and where we are going. I will do so through the lens of international economics, a field that has been transformed repeatedly by world events. And my argument is really very simple. Globalization has produced achievements of historical significance that deserve greater recognition than they often receive. At the same time, globalization has generated strains, and these strains have altered politics, policy, and from our point of view, research agendas. The interaction between these achievements and these strains has shaped much of modern international economics. So looking back to the period mentioned by Eric, when Jonathan Eaton and I took the graduate trade course at Harvard, international trade theory looked very much different from what it is today. The field revolved largely around Ricardian and Heckscher-Ohlin models. This framework did provide profound insights into sources of comparative advantage, but they had little to say about economies of scale, product differentiation, and global supply chains. These concepts, which today seem indispensable, barely entered the conversation at the time. Empirical work faced very similar limitations. Data were sparse. Computing power was limited, and theoretical models generated few predictions that could be tested directly. When you consider that Ricardo published his book in 1817, Heckscher his article in 1919, and Ohlin his book in 1933, it is quite astonishing that the first rigorous test of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem was not published until, and listen carefully, 1987. And that Ricardo's model became empirically usable only in 2002. In retrospect, what is striking is how much both the world economy and our discipline have changed since then. The rise of the new trade theory that Eric mentioned introduced increasing returns and imperfect competition into the analysis of trade. Together with the subsequent incorporation of firm heterogeneity, it fundamentally altered how we think about international exchange. Instead of treating countries as the key players, economies increasingly focus on firms. That shift proved extraordinarily fruitful. It helped to understand multinational production, global value chains, innovation, technology diffusion, and the organization of economic activity across borders. The development of tractable models of international trade, together with the enormous improvement in data and computing power, made it possible to bring theory and measurement much closer together. Let me now turn to 3 facts that I believe are essential for evaluating globalization. These facts are not controversial among specialists, yet they often receive surprisingly little attention in public debate. So fact 1 has to do with trade and growth. Consider figure 1 that you can see now. What you see is a remarkably simple pattern. Countries that experience larger increases in trade openness after World War II generally experience faster growth in income per capita. Of course, correlation is not causation. And economists have spent many years debating precisely how trade affects economic growth. But after years of research, it is difficult to avoid the conclusion that international integration has been an important source of productivity growth. Not the only source, but an important source. Trade does more than move goods across borders. It moves ideas. It facilitates learning. It accelerates the diffusion of technology. In work with David Coe more than 30 years ago, we argued that productivity growth depends not only on domestic research and development, but also on the research and development embodied in trade with foreign partners. We provided some evidence to support this argument. Today, there is a much broader body of evidence that supports the view that international productivity spills over across economic borders. Figure 2 that you see now illustrates this point nicely with evidence from a recent paper. The left panel shows that countries that were more open, which means they had smaller expenditure shares on their own product. This is what's on the horizontal axis in this figure, experienced faster productivity growth. And the right panel shows that countries that traded more intensively with highly productive partners also experienced faster productivity growth. The message from this is straightforward. Trade changes not only what countries produce, it also changes their productivity and growth. In our book, Innovation and Growth in the Global Economy, Gene Grossman and I developed a theory that was mentioned by Eric that helps explaining these types of findings. So the second fact I want to discuss is global inequality. So now consider figure 3 that you see now. So for nearly 150 years, global inequality rose. In this figure, every individual is measured as an individual no matter from which countries they come. So the mostly rich countries pulled further and further ahead of the rest of the world initially. Then, in the mid-1990s, the trend reversed. Poorer countries began catching up. Notice in this figure that both the rise and the subsequent decline in inequality were driven primarily by changes in inequality across countries, which is shown by the pattern of the dark bars. And the yellow bars show the pattern for inequality within countries. When you add it up, you get the total inequality. So at its core, this is a story about divergence and convergence across countries. China and India obviously played a big role in this convergence, but they were not alone. Many countries integrated into global production networks and experienced sustained growth. Figure 4 that you see now provides an illustration. So this is data on countries' participation in global supply chains. China's participation in global value chains grew by about 5% per year during that period, a rate comparable to Bulgaria and Poland. Yet some of the fastest growth in participation in global value chains occurred in countries such as Vietnam and Cambodia, who also grew very fast in terms of income per capita. Now, these countries did not become prosperous despite globalization. They became prosperous through globalization. The third fact I want to discuss concerns extreme poverty. And this is a particularly impressive fact, I believe. So consider figure 5. It traces the evolution of extreme poverty, defined by the World Bank as living on less than $1 per person per day in 1985 prices, and over time they adjust this to PPP changes. This picture is really extraordinary. In 1981, nearly 60% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. By 2019, the figure had fallen to roughly 10%. During this span of time, about 1.3 billion people escaped extreme poverty. This is pretty impressive, I would say. There are, of course, multiple causes of this achievement. Domestic institutions mattered, education mattered, technological progress mattered, and policies did matter. But it is difficult to imagine this transformation without the integration of developing countries into the world economy. Well, from a universalist perspective, this reduction in poverty, I believe, is one of the greatest achievements of the post-war period, and it deserves to be recognized as such. Yet, if globalization has achieved so much, why has it become so controversial? So there is, of course, the simple answer that globalization generated both winners and losers, and that the world is composed of countries, and this is important for this argument, whose perspective is not universalist. Countries care about themselves, and in countries, politics matter a great deal. Skepticism toward globalization grew in recent decades. Figure 6 captures this evolution through an index of voters' isolationist tendencies in 23 countries, and the dark curve describes the average across these countries. Similar figures can represent other aspect of this. So this backlash has manifested itself not only in voter attitudes, it also manifested itself in party manifestos, in legislative activity, and executive policies. For each one of these, there's a comparable curve. At the same time, however, public opinion data tell a more nuanced story. So the Gallup data reported in this table, Table 1, show that Americans have increasingly likely to view trade as an opportunity rather than a threat. So today, 82% of respondents hold this view, and in 1992, only 44% of the respondents held this view. So we face an apparent puzzle. Political behavior often appears more hostile toward globalization than survey responses suggest. One possible explanation lies in the growing importance of identity politics. People do not evaluate globalization solely through the lens of income. They also evaluate it through the lens of community, belonging, and national identity. This observation has become increasingly important for understanding contemporary politics. Political scientist Ashley Jardina, in her book, White Identity Politics, shows that it played a major role in Donald Trump's election in 2016. And similarly, political scientist Michael Frieden argued that it was a key factor in the outcome of the Brexit referendum. Jean Grossman and I combined insights from social psychology and political science to show how a rise in populism, which by some political scientists is considered to be a form of identity politics, can work through the electoral system to produce greater protectionism. So this is a useful reminder that purely economic models cannot fully explain this type of outcomes. No issue has been more central to the backlash against globalization than within-country inequality. In the previous slide on inequality, I emphasized inequality across countries. So I want to shift now to within-country inequality. Figure 7 is very interesting in this respect. The rise in the college wage premium in the United States, depicted in the right panel, was absolutely astounding. And this took place while the relative hours worked by college graduates was rising, as depicted in the left panel in this figure. Workers with higher levels of education increasingly pulled away from those with less education. For many years, international trade was widely blamed for this development. The logic was straightforward. As poorer countries entered global markets, demand for low-skilled labor in advanced economies would decline. And with decline in demand, there will be a decline in their relative wage, which is what we see in this figure. But the evidence is only partially supportive of this hypothesis. Reviewing the literature in my book, Globalization and Inequality, I reached the conclusion that trade probably accounts for no more than 20% of the rise in wage inequality. Well, 20% is significant, certainly, but not dominant. The larger forces appear to have been technological change, which I have also discussed. But look now at figure 8. It points to one important aspect of this process. And this is from a recent paper that was published actually last month. Wage changes were negatively related to task displacement with robots, as illustrated by the downward sloping curves. There is a little bit of difference between them, but I will not talk about this difference. Acemoglu and Restrepo estimated in this paper that automation accounted for 52% of the rise in between-group wage inequality. The implication is important. Many of the economic developments commonly attributed to globalization are in fact rooted in technological change. The work of Otto, Dorn, and Hanson on the China shock shifted attention away from wage inequality to regional equality. And their analysis showed that import competition from China did not have a large effect on the college wage premium across US commuting zones. Instead, however, regions that were more exposed to Chinese imports experienced decline in manufacturing employment, reductions in labor force participation, and increased reliance on government transfers. These findings changed the conversation. The gains from trade may be broadly dispersed across the economy, but the losses are often geographically concentrated, and therefore, and this is very important, politically salient. The lesson, I think, is not that globalization failed. The lesson is that successful globalization requires successful adjustment. And this is no different from technological progress. Technological change also requires successful adjustment. Indeed, this is an area where many economists, not necessarily economists, have performed less well than they should have. When adjustment policies are inadequate, the consequences can be severe, with hardship concentrated in particular regions and communities. A vivid example is provided by Amy Goldstein in her book, Janesville, An American Story. This book accounts the experience of a town in Wisconsin following the closure of a General Motors plant and traces the profound impact on workers, families, and the community as a whole. Her reporting is both powerful and, in fact, pretty heartbreaking. The political response to these developments has increasingly taken the form of trade restrictions. Figure 9 shows the dramatic increase in trade interventions since the global financial crisis. The increase affected trade in goods, represented by green bars, trade in services, represented by yellow bars, and investment measures, represented by red bars. Figure 10 illustrates the extraordinary escalation of tariffs during the two recent trade wars between the US and China. Before the first trade war in 2018-2019, average US tariffs on both Chinese and non-Chinese imports were relatively low. The United States then raised tariffs only on imports from China. During the second trade war, however, the United States expanded its tariff increase beyond China and imposed higher tariffs on imports from many other countries as well. As the figure shows, after several rounds of escalation and partial reversals, average US tariffs in November 2025, namely last year's November, had reached more than 47% on imports from China and more than 18% on imports from other countries. At the same time, Chinese average tariffs on imports from the United States stood at approximately 32%. By contrast, Chinese tariffs on imports from countries other than the United States remained essentially unchanged. For economists, these developments present both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because they force us to analyze policies that many assumed belonged largely to history. An opportunity because they allow us to evaluate theories against new real-world events. One lesson that emerges from recent work is that policy evaluations depend heavily on the structural models used for this purpose. In some settings, tariffs appear to be relatively benign. In others, they appear to be substantially more costly. The difference often depends on features such as accounting for things like intermediate input, supply chain reorganizations, or firm heterogeneity. For these reasons, I have often described calibration exercises commonly used in our field as examples of what I call quantitative theorizing. Remember this term, it's an important term. The purpose of calibrations is not necessarily to provide precise point estimates. Their purpose is often to illuminate an economic mechanism. They help us understand which forces matter and why. Now, this per se is an important contribution, even when exact numerical estimates remain uncertain. And they should not be sold as providers of precise numerical estimates. Economists often disagree about the quantitative consequences of tariffs or other policy, not because they necessarily disagree about economic logic, but because they emphasize different mechanisms. So consider the estimates of welfare changes resulting from a 40% tariff on US imports presented in Table 2 here. And these estimates were derived via calibration, although the authors of these estimates never pushed them as precise estimates. The striking feature is not the precise magnitude of the welfare effects here. It is the comparison between specifications with and without intermediate inputs. The right-hand panel gives you the estimates with intermediate inputs. In Australia, Brazil, Canada, and India, the estimated losses roughly double once intermediate inputs are taken into account, while in China and France, they nearly triple. The lesson is not that one should take the second column that accounts for intermediate inputs literally and ignore the first. The lesson is that intermediate inputs matter enormously. Since they account for majority of world trade, any framework that ignores intermediate inputs is likely to miss an essential part of the story. The same lesson emerges from my work with Gene Grossman and Stephen Redding on the first US-China trade war. The gains from terms of trade improvement was modest in our analysis, which is consistent with other estimates. But once we allowed firms to reorganize supply chains and incur costs of searching for new suppliers in face of the tariff shock, the welfare consequences became much bigger. Again, I do not view these calculations as precise measurement. I view them as quantitative theorizing. I view them as evidence about the relative importance of different mechanisms. And that distinction matters. A calibrated model that reproduces observed data perfectly, as is often done, is not necessarily a model that provides reliable estimates of counterfactual outcomes. That is why recent work by Addo, Costino, and Donaldson, published last year, as well as the forthcoming work by one of our students, Buzz Sanders, is extremely valuable. These papers provide methods for assessing the uncertainty surrounding such counterfactual estimates, helping us better understand not only what the model predicts, but also how much confidence we should place in those predictions. Let me now turn to strategic trade policy and geopolitics. The modern strategic trade theory can be traced back to the 1970s and 1980s. Following the oil crisis of 1973, Japanese automobile producers gained substantial market share in the United States by exporting small, fuel-efficient cars. Much as we see today, this development intensified concerns about foreign competition, industrial decline, and the future of American manufacturing. It sparked an intense debate about industrial policy and international competitiveness. Books such as Japan as Number One or Head to Head captured the prevailing concern that the United States was losing ground to Asian competitors. At the same time, economists began asking whether governments could use trade policy strategically to improve national welfare. And the question gave rise to a strategic trade policy literature led by James Brander and Barbara Spencer. In their original model, two firms from different countries compete in quantities for market share in the world economy. In this setting, an export subsidy shifts profits from the foreign rival to the domestic firm. As a result, national welfare increases. Many people at the time cheered this result. At first glance, this seemed to provide a powerful argument for activist trade policy. But I believe that one of the most important lessons from this literature is the results can be fragile, and that careful sensitivity analysis is often required, more often than we see. The Branders-Pemsen result depends on a number of restrictive assumptions. It assumes only two firms, one in each of two countries, no entry, no foreign retaliation, and quantity competition. Once these assumptions are relaxed, the conclusions change dramatically. If there are several domestic firms, they impose negative externalities on one another, reducing the gains from export subsidies. If entry is free, subsidies attract new firms and dissipate profits. If foreign governments respond with similar policies, both countries end up worse off. So we are in a sort of prisoner's dilemma type situation. And as Jonathan Eaton and Gene Grossman showed, if firms compete in prices rather than quantities, the optimal policy is actually a tax on exports rather than a subsidy. The broader lesson is straightforward. Strategic trade policy cannot be evaluated through simple slogans. Its effects depend critically on market structure, on conduct, and on the strategic responses of firms and governments. Today, the challenge is even greater because multinational enterprises dominate the global economy. To put this in perspective, in 2022, sales by majority-owned foreign affiliates of US firms exceeded, and listen carefully, $4.5 trillion. And this was more than twice the value of US goods exports. So multinational firms, which are giant, are very important. And they also account for the majority of US trade flows. And obviously they make complex decisions about where to locate production, where to source inputs, and where to sell their products. Understanding these decisions requires models that incorporate fixed costs. Without it, you can't get the right answer. Multinational production, global supply chains, and importantly, endogenous location choices. For many years, these problems were computationally intractable, just too big. More recently, however, important methodological advances have made it possible to analyze them in a rigorous way. Researchers such as Eduardo Morales and his collaborators have been at the forefront of this effort. One recent work by Kit Head, Thierry Mayer, Mark Melitz, and Shenying Yang on battery electric cars illustrates this. Their analysis showed that industrial policies can induce substantial reallocations of production and sourcing across countries. In particular, subsidies to domestic assembly and battery production, which are common policies, can significantly reshape global supply chains. These studies remind us that there is always a trade-off in research. And this is an important message for the young researchers, between realism and generality. Richer models capture important features of the world, but they are harder to embed in general equilibrium frameworks. And therefore, finding the right balance between what's feasible and how well you describe reality remains an important challenge in any type of research of this nature. In recent years, strategic trade policy has taken on an entirely new dimension. The intensifying rivalry between the United States and China has shifted attention from traditional concerns about profits and market shares to broader questions of national security, technological leadership, and geopolitical influence. Trade policy is increasingly used as an instrument of geopolitical competition. Figure 11 shows that concerns about national security now appear with growing frequency in WTO discussions, reflecting this changing environment. To understand these developments, we need to move beyond purely economic objectives, as I said more than once so far, and think explicitly, in this case, in game theoretic and geopolitical terms. In joint work with John Becko and Jean Grossman, we examined a world with two large powers, to which we gave names. One we called the United States, the other we called China, and many smaller countries. In this framework, large countries offer trade concessions in exchange for political alignment, while countries outside these arrangements face higher MFN tariffs. The resulting equilibrium in this theoretical model determines equilibrium tariffs, alliances, trade flows, and welfare outcomes. Using information on voting behavior in the United Nations, estimates of the value of Security Council support, and military spending data, we calibrate the model and study the interaction between trade policy and geopolitics. So this is a calibration exercise of the type I call quantitative theorizing. Our findings suggest that geopolitical considerations account for a substantial part of the equilibrium tariff levels. They also reveal important asymmetries between the United States and China. In a counterfactual exercise, as China's economic weight increases, geopolitical concerns play an increasingly important role in US tariff decisions in the model. In contrast, these considerations appear to have a much smaller effect on Chinese trade policy. The broader lesson is that trade policy today cannot be understood solely through the lens of economics. And I'm just repeating myself, but I think it's important to say. It must also be viewed as part of a wider strategic and geopolitical competition. The stakes are therefore much larger than the economic cost of tariffs alone. As Graham Allison has argued in his book, Destined for War, historical examples show that failure of an established power to accommodate a rising power can create conditions that lead to a military conflict. Historian Odd Arne Westad similarly contends in his recent book called the coming storm, that by some measures, the current geopolitical environment resembles the period preceding World War I. There is something a bit queasy about me making this observation here in Serbia. Whether or not one agrees with these assessments, they highlight the importance of developing a deeper understanding of the tensions and interdependencies that characterize the international economy. Let me conclude by looking forward and returning to where I began. The history of international economics is, in many respects, a story of successful adaptation. The world changed, our theories changed, our empirical methods changed, and our understanding deepened. At the same time, many important questions remain unresolved. How should we think about economic integration in a world of geopolitical rivalry? How should we evaluate industrial policies designed to reshape global supply chains? How should we balance efficiency against resilience? How should we understand the interaction between globalization, technological change, and politics? These questions will occupy researchers for years to come. The race between world events and academic inquiry shows no sign of slowing down. If anything, it is accelerating. That is why it is worth remembering where we came from, as I tried to illustrate. The achievements of globalization were real. The strains it generated are real as well. Our task is neither to celebrate globalization uncritically nor condemn it reflexively. Our task is to understand it. And if we succeed, we may help illuminate not only where we came from, but also where we are going. Thank you very much.